Episode 2 of A Night at the Seven Kingdoms, Salt Beef, picks up where Episode 1 does perfectly, and matches the energy and the vibe and pace established. If anything, the pace worked much better this episode, given there is less time spent setting up and establishing what's going on. This is both good and bad. It's good in the sense that the story flowed much better, but bad in the sense it was so smooth that if you blinked, the episode was already over. I for one do understand and support the call for 30-minute episodes, but you really felt the length this week. I guess it's a mark of a good show that I am left wanting more. Speaking of length, it seems that this week's random no-context joke was the enormous size of Ser Arlan of Pennytree's member. A very random inclusion that got an eyebrow raise and a chuckle, much less opinion splitting as the shitting from episode 1. I'm guessing we're going to get one of these random body humour jokes each week. Don't hate it, don't love it. I can take it or leave it. The show really does ride that line between light-hearted comedy and emotional character moments perfectly, which is not an easy thing to do. Most shows that try something like that will end up falling one side or the other. I think it really comes across in the writing that Ira Parker very much read the book and understood the characters and the story George was telling. I think it was clear going into the show that we're going to have to spend some time fleshing out Dunc and Ser Arlan's relationship. In the book, we learn about Arlan via Dunc's internal monologue. So, in a way, we saw Duncan's very idolised version of Ser Arlan. What I like about the show is even if Duncan never expressly states it, while he respects and sees the best in the man Ser Arlan was, he is aware he was a flawed man and not perfect, even if he doesn't highlight it to Egg. It also seems that we have been given an idea of why Ser Arlan died. In the book, we don't really get much of a suggestion. It comes across as he simply just died of old age or perhaps some quick illness. But it seems that in the show at least, he dies of an infected wound. We see in some flashbacks after the member shot, Arlan has a large cut on his arm that seems to get more infected in subsequent flashbacks, till he eventually falls from his horse on the way to Ashford. My interpretation of this, in the first shots, he was very much trying to hide the wound. I do wonder if Duncan is even aware of why Arlan died. I know some book purists are not going to be pleased with some of these changes made to Arlan and his relationship with Duncan, but the reality is, not only was the show always going to have to flesh out his character, given the lack of Duncan's internal monologue, short length of the novella, new content was always going to be added and expanding upon Arlan's role, and the show has found a good way of doing this without needlessly impacting the rest of the main Ashford tourney storyline. It almost seems that during the opening in the tourney, Dunc has some kind of panic attack, where he either realises for the first time this idea he has of Ser Arlan is idealised and not reality, or at the very least, the facade in what he tells himself to cope with his loss is briefly cracked, allowing the sheer weight of Duncan's choices to finally hit him. I really like how the Kingsguard Knights, Sir Donald of Duskendale and Sir Roland Crakehall, were introduced. I loved the chemistry between Donald and Roland, as well as the fact they don't seem to look down on Duncan. I also really love the way Duncan has this sheer admiration for the two knights, and it really highlights how for most knights the idea of joining the Kingsguard is the most special of privileges reserved for the very best of the best. Very few characters in Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon give the Kingsguard the kind of respect they truly deserve. So it's nice to see Duncan sort of in awe of these two men. I think the only other time we see something like this is Bran in Season 1 of Game of Thrones. Of course, it's fair to point out that the Kingsguard and their reputation is defined by the kind of men in it. It's clear by the time in the main books and main series, barring a few exceptions. The current crop of Kingsguard under King Robert and then Joffrey and Tommen are not the cream of the crop. They are not the best of the best, with even the Kingsguard under the Mad King still holding great esteem and respect. Out of all the variations of the Kingsguard armour we've seen so far across the HBO shows, this version seen in A Night at the Seven Kingdoms is by far my favourite. I really love how clean and sharp it is, and I really love the enamel look to it. It really helps the armour stand out against all the others we've seen in the show. I really enjoyed how they played around with Sir Donald of Duskendale's backstory. The idea he seems to be some humble crabber's son, but in reality, while he is not part of the nobility, his family is still extremely well off. One of the biggest challenges the show was always going to face when adapting from page to screen is the fact that Dunc is our only point of view. There are things we learn about from Duncan that happened off screen. Thus, they were going to have to find some way to communicate these things to the audience. The show has found many ways of dealing with this. Last week they used Dunc talking to the horses. This week they seem to have solved these issues by changing the manner in which Duncan meets Baelor Breakspear for the first time, via sneaking into the castle at Ashford. While there are of course elements of the book version I do miss, such as Dunc not initially knowing he is talking to Baelor, I think the way Baelor and Maekar are introduced as they enter the castle tells the audience everything we need to know about their relationship and their characters. Baelor, the beloved and respected heir and hand of the king, and Maekar, the angry and forgotten younger brother who doesn't get the same level of respect as his elder siblings, despite being just as worthy of it. Changing the way Dunc meets Baelor gives us this brief insight into the relationship dynamic between the brothers, which is really important to the story. I think the casting of Baelor is spot on. Bertie Carvel is just how I pictured the character of Baelor in the books. Maekar, on the other hand, isn't quite what I personally imagined. Sam Spurrell very much looks how I pictured Maekar, but the way I personally read Maekar in my head is a bit more like Stannis Baratheon in his personality, with the show seeming to lean more into the younger brother angle. But saying that, I really did like the character and can't wait to see more of him as the story progresses for obvious reasons, especially later into the story. I don't think we've had enough time or seen enough of Aerion Brightflame to really make any judgments at this point. But from the little time we did have of him this episode, he's definitely the arrogant prince we know from the book. I can very much picture him in his role in the rest of the story. Now, there was a bit of upset online that Aerion has short hair versus his long hair in the book, but I really don't think it matters. If anything, the most outward part of his appearance for me that has changed is not his hair, but this sleeveless vest. It's not like anything we've seen before in the shows, and again, really helps to make him stand out. The chemistry between Dunc and Egg shines through and is very much the heart of the show. It's really hard to say if it's down to the writing or the actor's performance. It's probably a bit of both if we're telling the truth. I really like how Egg very much seems wise beyond his years, and how Duncan always seems to look to him for reassurance that he's saying or doing the right thing. The standout scene with them this week were with Tansel. Again, a brilliant bit of casting that matches my book interpretation perfectly. I love how awkward Dunc is throughout their exchange, and how Egg is always trying to bail him out and set him on the right path. Again, I really enjoy how they're using the puppet shows for these lore dumps, with some deep lore and legend from the world history. This week, the story was Florian the Fool. I know these puppet shows are part of the book, but going into the show, I was very worried they were only going to focus on the dragon-related shows for obvious story reasons, and sideline the others to save money. While you might not think it, doing these puppet shows really would cost a fair chunk of the budget, more than you might expect. I also liked Egg's curiosity about how they made the fire, and him seemingly being aware of the method they had used. I think him knowing that is a very clear indication about his character, and if you're into the deep lore of A Song of Ice and Fire, you understand why Egg caring about something like that could be important, and I wonder if this was supposed to be alluding to that. My favourite scene this episode is the brief one after the meeting with Tansel, where Dunc and Egg are drinking ale, with Dunc asking if the interaction was poorly handled. It's not just a well-acted or written scene. It's framed and shot beautifully, and tells the viewer everything they need to know about Dunc and Egg's relationship dynamic, and the bond they formed in such a short space of time. The tug-of-war scene is another show-only addition, but a welcome one that is well placed in the episode and story, and feels like it fits in within the context of the episode. It does two important things. It adds life to the tourney, showing the audience that it's more than just jousting, but a full-on festival for nobles and commons alike. It's a real party atmosphere. It also once again helps build a relationship between Dunc and Lionel Baratheon. I really enjoy Lionel as a character, even though he's arguably the most different in terms of his book counterpart. But I understand why the show has chosen to go this way with his more flamboyant side, and the function having a character like that plays in the show. There is rightly some criticism that on the first day of being a knight, it seems unrealistic Dunc would be interacting with the High Lords like this and becoming best friends with Lionel Baratheon. I do think that's a fair point, and the book version of this does make more sense in terms of realism. But in terms of serving the story, and if you're a book reader, knowing where the story goes, it makes sense to me why Ira Parker has chosen to expand Dunc and Lionel's relationship in the way he has. I really hope that Lionel isn't just going to be this one-note flamboyant character, and that he will have some more weight to him as the story progresses after certain events come to transpire. The scene where Dunc buys his armour from Steely Pate, to me, is very important because it really helps get across to the viewer just how poor Duncan is and the sheer stakes at play, how much he's risking by entering the lists. This is his one and only shot. If he doesn't come out with a positive outcome, he will lose everything and will likely end up destitute or simply being some simple town guard somewhere. Dunc selling Sweetfoot is one of the saddest parts of the books for me, and a bitter dose of realism, a bit I always hate reading. And the show does this scene very well. And it's maybe even sadder because of how they use Dunc's relationship with the horses to set up his character. It gives the viewer a true deep look at the very heart of the kind of man Duncan is. While he might be as thick as a castle wall, he has a huge heart and cares so much for what little he has and those around him. It really translates to screen very well. For me, the jousting scene really proves you don't need dragons and huge set-piece battles for A Song of Ice and Fire on TV to be this interesting and dynamic spectacle. The way it was shot really highlighted the sheer speed of the action and its brutality in a way we've not seen thus far at any of the tourneys in the main show. Don't get me wrong, the hands tourney in Season 1 of Game of Thrones is brutal, but the actual jousting seems like it's in slow motion compared to A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. I think what really helps this is the format of the joust itself being a fast and dynamic setup, where you have 7 jousts all happening at the same time rather than one joust at a time. It builds up into sheer chaos. I really appreciate the use of colour on the armour. For example, the reds and the blues of House Tully's armour. It very much makes the armour seen in House of the Dragon and the main show feel very bland and plain. It makes sense that the knights would use these bright colours and colourful armours, given it was a method of self-expression and making them stand out on the field. If anything, this use of colour is more akin to how it would have been in real-life tourneys. Bright and colourful dyes and armours would have been something exclusive to the rich, so it makes sense they would want to flaunt their wealth in such a way. We already talked about Dunc's panic attack and him turning that into motivation, but I think it's a really good idea to use it during this scene in this manner. I think I enjoyed episode 2 of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms even more than the first. I genuinely laughed out loud at a couple of the jokes, and I thought it struck a really great balance between being heartfelt, comedic, and dramatic, without it undercutting each other, which is a really hard thing to do, with both Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon often not able to walk this line. There's been some criticism the show is too light-hearted and funny, which I think is valid and fair, but I would argue it's important to remember where we currently are in the story. I suspect next week will follow a similar format, but start to take a more serious tone, with that serious tone really coming to the forefront after episode 3 for obvious reasons. I gave episode 1 8.5 last week, and I can't see a reason why episode 2 does not deserve this score as well. It does everything last week did and remains consistent. Also remember, for me, if you know my House of the Dragon reviews, 8.5 is a really strong score. The episode length debate is still going on, and will for the rest of the season. While I talked about it at length in my last review, HBO were not really left with too many choices when it came to the runtime, and I think this is likely the best compromise out there. I think the best praise I can give the show is that as the credits roll each week, I feel genuinely sad and left wanting more, which is only a good thing. I've not felt that way for a Song of Ice and Fire show since the early seasons of Game of Thrones, or the first few seasons of Stranger Things, and of course shows like The Last Kingdom. I have a feeling as long as Ira Parker doesn't drop the ball with the rest of the show, we could be dealing with a show on par if not better than the first season of Game of Thrones, which is not something I thought I would be saying at this stage at my most hopeful.